Hello guys, welcome back to another Spring Boot episode. Today I'll continue from where I stopped in the previous lesson about filters. The previous lesson we learned about the filters and an example for a filter. Now let's continue our lesson. Let's make another example using filters. First thing we have our filter 1 mapped inside the web.xml like this with the URL pattern / for everything, and in the filter we'll make our application. First thing we'll be using do filter for this. We'll say http server request r equals request, and because there's an error we have to cast this. We'll cast this to http servlet request. Then we check if r.getSession.getAttribute u not equals to null, and here we say chain.doFilter. We'll call the doFilter with the request and response. And next thing we'll have a else. We say we copy this line from our tutorial and we paste this. If the else comes to pass, we'll request the get dispatcher to forward it to webinf's index.jsp file. Okay, now that's finished. Now let's go to the index.jsp file. Here we'll add the tag library. We say add and we'll call taglib, and the prefix will be x, and the next thing URL will be JSTL core. Next thing we'll have a x choose tag placed. Inside it will have our x when tag. In the when tag we'll say session scope dot u not equals to null, and if that comes to pass we'll have a code here, and the next thing we'll have x otherwise. If that comes to pass we'll have the otherwise. If the session scope u is not equals to null, we'll have an import x import. URL will be process.jsp, and here inside the otherwise we'll have HTTP. We'll have form tag placed form, and here we'll have input first. Input type text, name, and next another input tag, input type password, and name will be pass, and later on we'll have input type of submit, and the value will be login. And we'll have an action for the form. We say index.jsp. Alright. Now let's run this in the browser. We'll go to localhost 8080 and we get an error message because we didn't close this import. So let's run this again. When we refresh the page, we get our login form. This happens because the session scope is actually now equals to null. To remove the null value, we'll have a scriptlet tag, and inside it we say session.set attribute, and we'll give u as the key, which will be used in the when tag, and here we'll give a name for this as Kulesh. Now what will happen? Let's check it out. And when we refresh the page, we get process.jsp because now there's a session attribute created inside the application. Okay. Next we learn about multiple filter mapping. We can use our add web filter to map first the filter name as filter1 and URL patterns as backslash process.jsp and backslash new.jsp. We can put it inside our filter. Let's check it out. We'll paste this here and let's run this, and if there's no error, that means everything is working. Okay, now let's run this. And there's no error. That means our web filter is working perfectly well. Okay. We can map our filters, many URL patterns for our filter in the XML web.xml file. We can have many URL patterns like this. We copy this and paste it here. So we'll have a URL pattern for the new.jsp and a process.jsp as well. All these patterns work for our first filter one. Let's learn ways in which a servlet or JSP executes. HTTP request coming from the client side will execute it, and a servlet forward and a servlet include. These methods let us know how a filter is executed. This method is called dispatcher type. If by any chance we never map a filter with dispatcher, the default dispatcher is done in client request. So here in the filter mapping, we'll provide a dispatcher request. And let's run this application and check what happens. When we refresh the page, we get our process.jsp. That means this worked for the request. And we can use forward as well. Let's check an instance for forward. Let's change this to forward. And the next thing, we'll have this copied and pasted in the body. Now this will work if we'll give the process.jsp and we'll run this and check if the forward dispatcher type works perfectly. Let's refresh the page and we get our process.jsp as expected. Okay. There's also include, which can be used. We can't use the include directory for this because it's done in translation time. Filter works at include but not when request is sent or forwarded. We can provide all the dispatcher types in the filter mapping. Now we can provide request dispatcher and forward dispatcher both at once inside the filter mapping. Let's have them both pasted here. Okay. Both can be used at one time. Now let's learn how to annotate the dispatcher. We can have an annotation like this for the dispatcher. We'll have it inside the filter1.java. Here what we've done is we've declared a web filter. Filter name is filter1 and URL patterns are all \all. Dispatcher types are dispatcher type.forward. This will work for the forward. Likewise, let's have another one to have many dispatcher types. For this, what we'll do is we'll paste this here, and here dispatcher types are equal to dispatcher type.forward, dispatcher type.request. Both are used for the dispatcher type. In the URL pattern, if we give this as \all, that means everything like in every URL pattern is taken, and the filter works for every URL pattern. What if we say all .jsp? If we do this, all JSPs will be working for this filter. Alright, today we learned the last lesson about the filters. We learned how to do an example for a login with the filters. We learned about the filter mapping, multiple filter mapping methods, and we learned about the ways in which servlet or JSP executes, and we learned about dispatcher types like request, forward and include, and finally we learned how to annotate a dispatcher inside our web filter. Alright, so this is today's lesson, and I'll see you in another one. Until then, goodbye guys.